Have you ever been so desperate for a job that you ignored every warning sign screaming at you to run? I mean really desperate. The kind of desperate where your savings account is down to 3 digits. Your landlord is sending increasingly aggressive texts, and you've started calculating whether you can survive on ramen and tap water for another month. That was me 6 years ago, sitting in the lobby of Meridian Consulting with my best interview suit on and my last shred of dignity carefully tucked into my briefcase. The office looked legitimate enough. Glass doors with the company logo etched professionally across them. Leather chairs in the waiting area that probably cost more than my car. Abstract art on the walls that I didn't understand, but that screamed, "We have money." Everything about Meridian Consulting said success, stability, opportunity. Everything except the receptionist's eyes. Her name was Sarah, according to the nameplate on her desk. Mid-30s, professional blazer, perfectly styled hair. But her eyes looked haunted, like she'd seen things she couldn't unsee. I noticed her watching me from the moment I walked in. This strange mix of pity and urgency on her face. At first, I thought maybe I had something on my suit, or my resume had a typo I'd somehow missed during my 17 obsessive reviews. But it wasn't that. The interview itself went almost too well. You know that feeling when something seems too good to be true, but you're so desperate that you silence that little voice of reason in your head? The hiring manager, Mr. Peterson, was all smiles and firm handshakes. He praised my experience, called my references glowing, and said I was exactly what they were looking for in a senior operations coordinator. The role sounded perfect, challenging but manageable, room for growth, great team culture. And the salary? $90,000 a year. I almost cried right there in his office. $90,000. After 8 months of unemployment, after burning through my savings, after the humiliation of moving back in with my parents at 32 years old, after hundreds of applications and dozens of rejections, finally, someone was offering me not just a job, but a good job. A career rebuilding, life-changing, dignity-restoring job. Mr. Peterson said they'd send over the official offer letter by end of day, but that he was confident we'd found the perfect fit. He walked me back to the lobby with his hand on my shoulder like we were already colleagues, already part of the Meridian family. I was floating. I was mentally calculating how quickly I could get my own apartment again, whether I could finally replace my dying laptop, if I could actually afford to go out to dinner somewhere that didn't have a dollar menu. That's when Sarah, the receptionist, did something that probably saved my life, or at least saved me from financial ruin, which at that point felt like the same thing. As Mr. Peterson disappeared back into the office maze, Sarah stood up from her desk. She glanced around nervously, like she was checking for security cameras or lurking managers, then walked over to me with purpose. "Can I talk to you for just a moment?" she asked quietly. "Outside." My first instinct was confusion. Maybe this was part of their process, some kind of informal culture assessment, but the urgency in her voice made my stomach clench. We stepped out into the hallway, away from the glass doors, and Sarah looked at me with those haunted eyes again. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen carefully," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The salary they just quoted you, $90,000? Yes." My heart was already sinking. "It's not real. The actual salary for that position is $45,000. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. "What?" "No," Mr. Peterson specifically said. I know what he said. He says it to everyone. Sarah pulled out her phone, glancing around again to make sure we were alone. "I've been working here for 2 years. I've watched this happen over and over again. They tell candidates one number during the interview, always verbal, never in writing at that stage, and then the actual offer letter shows exactly half. When people question it, management claims it was a miscommunication, that the candidate must have misheard, that they never would have offered such an inflated salary for that level position. My mind was racing. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be legal. But why would they do that? Because it works, Sarah said bitterly. Think about it. They target people who are unemployed, people who are desperate, people who have already quit their previous jobs or who have been out of work for months. By the time you get the offer letter and see the real number, you're already emotionally invested. You've already told your family you got the job. You've already started planning your life around that income. And most people, they're too embarrassed to fight back. They convince themselves maybe they did miss here, or maybe they can negotiate up, or maybe it's still better than nothing. So they take the $45,000 and try to make it work. I felt sick, literally nauseous. This is fraud. Yes, Sarah said simply. It is, and I can prove it. She showed me her phone, where she'd photographed employment contracts from recent hires. All of them showed the same pattern. Interview notes mentioning one salary, offer letters showing half. She had screenshots of internal emails where managers managers joked about managing expectations. She had recordings of phone calls where candidates questioned the discrepancy and were gaslit into accepting the lower number. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Why are you risking your job?" Sarah's eyes welled up. "Because I've watched too many people get destroyed by this. Single parents who took the job because they needed insurance for their kids, then couldn't afford rent on the actual salary. Recent graduates who moved across the country for the position, then found themselves trapped in a new city with no money and no support system. Career professionals who quit stable jobs for what they thought was a promotion, then ended up worse off than before." She told me about Marcus, a former teacher who'd been promised $65,000 but received $32,500. He'd already signed a lease on a new apartment based on the higher salary. When the Real offer came through, he was trapped. He couldn't afford the apartment on the actual pay, but he'd already paid first month, last month, and deposit. He couldn't back out of the lease without losing everything. He took the job, worked 70-hour weeks, trying to make ends meet, and had a nervous breakdown 6 months later. She told me about Jennifer, a single mother of 3 who'd been unemployed for almost a year. The promised $70,000 would have changed her family's life. The actual $35,000 barely covered childcare and rent. Jennifer worked at Meridian for 8 months, falling further into debt each month before finally having to file for bankruptcy. She told me about David, a mid-career professional who'd left a stable job at a competitor because Meridian promised him $85,000 and a path to management. The actual $42,500 was less than he'd been making at his previous job. He tried to go back to his old company, but they'd already hired his replacement. David ended up taking a job in a completely different field, essentially restarting his career at 47 years old. "The worst part," Sarah said, her voice shaking, "is that they know exactly what they're doing. The hiring manager keeps everything verbal during interviews specifically to avoid written evidence. They've even created fake salary surveys and market analysis reports to show candidates during negotiations to justify their competitive offers. It's all calculated. It's all intentional." I stood there in that hallway, processing everything Sarah had just told me, feeling my brief moment of hope crumble into dust. But alongside the devastation, I felt something else rising up inside me. Rage. "How many people?" I asked. "How many people have they done this to?" "In the 2 years I've been here, at least 50. But I've heard rumors it's been going on much longer. Maybe 5 years or more. 50 people in 2 years. Potentially hundreds over 5 years. Hundreds of lives disrupted, dreams crushed, financial stability destroyed. Also, this company could save money on labor costs while maintaining the appearance of offering competitive salaries. I'm going to stop them," I said. The words came out before I'd even fully formed the thought. Sarah looked at me with surprise and something that might have been hope. "Ow, I don't know yet, but I'm not walking away from this. The truth is, I had no idea what I was doing. I wasn't a lawyer. I wasn't an investigator. I was just an unemployed operations coordinator with a useless business degree and a growing sense of righteous fury. But sometimes that's enough. First, I did what any millennial in crisis does. I Googled everything. Employment law, wage fraud, false advertising, contract misrepresentation. I learned about the Department of Labor, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, state attorney general offices. I learned that what Meridian Consulting was doing wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. Very illegal. Then I asked Sarah if she'd be willing to be a whistleblower. I explained the protections that existed for employees who reported corporate fraud, the legal safeguards that should prevent retaliation. I also explained the risks, because I wasn't going to lie to her. This could get messy and there were no guarantees. Sarah didn't hesitate. "I'm in. I can't watch this happen anymore. I can't be complicit." We started building a case. Sarah provided documentation, contracts, emails, recorded phone calls where she'd been ordered to manage candidates who questioned their offers. I reached out to former Meridian employees through LinkedIn, carefully explaining what we were investigating and asking if they'd experienced similar bait and switch attacks. The responses came flooding in. Marcus, the former teacher, replied within hours. So did Jennifer, the single mother, and David, the mid-career professional, and dozens of others, each with their own story of betrayal and financial devastation. Some have been too embarrassed to speak up at the time. Others had tried to complain, but were shut down by HR or threatened with legal action for defaming the company. Many had simply accepted their fate, convinced they had no recourse. But together, we had power. We had documentation. We had a pattern of behavior spanning years. We had victims willing to testify. We had a receptionist on the inside who'd witnessed everything and kept meticulous records. I compiled everything into a comprehensive complaint and submitted it to the Department of Labor. I also sent copies to the State Attorney General's office and to several employment law firms who specialized in wage fraud cases. I wrote detailed accounts for employment review websites, carefully sticking to facts and documentation to avoid defamation claims. I even reached out to local journalists who covered business and labor issues. For a while, nothing happened. Weeks passed. I got a job at a different company, a legitimate one that actually paid what they promised, and tried to move on with my life. But I couldn't stop thinking about Meridian, about all the people they'd hurt, about the fact that they were probably still doing. Then, 3 months after I'd filed the initial complaint, I got a call from a Department of Labor investigator. They were opening a formal investigation into Meridian Consulting. They wanted to interview me, Sarah, and any other victims willing to participate. The investigation took almost a year. During that time, Meridian tried everything to shut it down. They hired expensive lawyers who claimed the whole thing was a misunderstanding, that any discrepancies between verbal discussions and written offers were simple mistakes, not intentional fraud. They argue that candidates had misheard or misremembered what was said in interviews. They produced their fake salary surveys as evidence that their offers were competitive. But we had too much evidence, too many victims with identical stories, too many internal documents showing that the bait and switch was company policy, not isolated incidents. Sarah's recordings were particularly damning. Managers explicitly discussing how to hook candidates with high numbers and then reality adjust them later. The Department of Labor's final report was devastating for Meridian Consulting. They found systematic wage fraud affecting over 200 employees over a 5-year period. They documented the intentional deception, the fake salary surveys, the internal policies designed to trap desperate job seekers. They calculated the total amount of wages that should have been paid versus what was actually paid. The company faced $750,000 in fines. They were ordered to pay back wages to every affected employee. The difference between what they were promised and what they actually received, plus interest. They were required to implement new hiring practices with oversight and auditing. Several executives, including Mr. Peterson, were personally fined and barred from holding management positions in the state for 5 years. Sarah received official whistleblower protection and a settlement for the retaliation she'd experienced after coming forward. The company had tried to fire her halfway through the investigation, claiming performance issues, but the Department of Labor had blocked it and added retaliation charges to the complaint. But the story didn't end there. Sarah used her newfound platform to expose other companies using similar tactics. She started a blog documenting employment scams and wage fraud schemes. She consulted with labor rights organizations and helped develop training programs to teach job seekers how to protect themselves from predatory hiring practices. Marcus went back to teaching, using his settlement money to pay off the debts he'd accumulated during his time at Meridian. Jennifer was able to get out of bankruptcy and provide stability for her kids. David used his settlement to start his own consulting business, one that actually valued honesty and treated employees fairly. As for me, I learned something important. Sometimes the worst moments in our lives lead us exactly where we need to be. If I hadn't been desperate enough to interview at Meridian, if Sarah hadn't been brave enough to warn me, if we hadn't decided to fight back, hundreds of people would still be suffering in silence, and a fraudulent company would still be destroying lives. I also learned that desperation makes us vulnerable, but it doesn't make us powerless. When we're at our lowest, when we're willing to accept anything just to survive, that's when we're most susceptible to exploitation. But it's also when we have the least to lose by fighting back. The warning signs were there from the beginning. The too good to be true salary. The insistence on keeping everything verbal. The receptionist's haunted eyes. But desperation has a way of making us ignore red flags, of convincing us that this time will be different, that we're overreacting, that we should just be grateful for the opportunity. I'm grateful I didn't ignore Sarah's warning. I'm grateful she was brave enough to speak up, even though it could have cost her everything. I'm grateful for every person who came forward to share their story, who relived their trauma and embarrassment to help build the case against Meridian. And I'm grateful that, in the end, justice actually prevailed. Because in too many of these stories, it doesn't. Companies get away with exploitation because victims are too afraid, too embarrassed, or too exhausted to fight. Whistleblowers get silenced. Investigations go nowhere. The powerful protect the powerful. But not this time. This time, the desperate job seeker and the brave receptionist and the army of victims took down a company that thought it was untouchable. This time, the people who've been told they were powerless prove that they weren't. If you're reading this and you're in a desperate situation, unemployed, underpaid, trapped in a bad job, please remember that you have value. You have rights. You have power, even when it doesn't feel like it. And if something seems too good to be true, if someone's making promises that don't quite add up, if you see those red flags waving, trust your instincts. Ask questions. Get everything in right. And if you discover you've been scammed, know that you're not alone and you don't have to accept it. There are resources available. The Department of Labor investigates wage fraud. Employment lawyers often work on contingency, meaning you don't pay unless you win. Labor rights organizations provide free advice and support. And there are people like Sarah out there working inside corrupt systems, waiting for someone brave enough to help them blow the whistle. 6 years later, I'm in a job I actually love, working for a company that treats people with respect and pays them fairly. Sarah runs a successful advocacy organization that's helped hundreds of workers fight back against employment scams. Meridian Consulting? They're still technically in business, but their reputation is destroyed. No one wants to work there. No one wants to do business with them. They're a cautionary tale, a warning to other companies that think they can exploit desperate people without consequences. And every time I hear about someone facing a similar situation, the too good to be true job offer, the verbal promises that don't match the paperwork, the company that preys on desperation, I think about that day in the hallway outside Meridian's office when a receptionist with haunted eyes saved me from making the biggest mistake of my life. Sometimes the people who save us are the ones we least expect. Sometimes justice takes longer than we'd like, but it's worth fighting for. And sometimes the worst thing that almost happens to us becomes the catalyst for something important, something that helps not just us, but hundreds of others. So if you're desperate right now, if you're considering taking a job that doesn't feel right just because you need something, anything, I get it. I've been there. But please pay attention to the warning signs. Listen to the Sarahs of the world. Trust your instincts. And know that your desperation doesn't make you worthless or powerless. It makes you human, and you deserve to be treated with dignity and honesty, no matter how badly you need the job. If you enjoyed this story, like and subscribe.